3 states over this past weekend. Today, the man believed to be responsible for Saturday's explosions in Manhattan and New Jersey, 28-year-old Ahmad Khan Rahami, was taken into custody after exchanging fire with Garden State Police. Authorities say Rahami is a naturalized U.S. citizen who was born in Afghanistan and reportedly traveled there several years ago, though there's no direct evidence that links him to the Islamic State, al-Qaeda, or other international terrorist groups. Meanwhile, the Islamic State is claiming responsibility for a knife attack inside a mall here in Minnesota on Saturday night, where 9 people were stabbed by a 22-year-old man who was fatally shot by an off-duty police officer at the scene. Fortunately, no lives were lost in any of these attacks. The political world has been quick to react this morning after Donald Trump responded to the latest attacks by defending racial profiling on Fox News. Hillary Clinton made the following remarks from an airplane hangar in White Plains, New York.
We also know from the former head of our counterterrorism center, Matt Olson, that the kinds of rhetoric and language that Mr. Trump has used is giving aid and comfort to our adversaries. That's why I've been very clear. We're going after the bad guys, and we're going to get them. But we're not going to go after an entire religion. We choose resolve, not fear. We will not turn on each other or undermine our values. We'll stand together because we are stronger together in the face of this threat and every other challenge.
That aid and comfort comment has gotten the most notice today. Those words echo verbatim the legal definition of treason. Trump shot back with this at his rally in Fort Myers, Florida this afternoon.
Hillary Clinton talks tougher about my supporters than she does about Islamic terrorists, right? She calls the patriotic Americans who support our campaign, many of them cops and soldiers, deplorable and irredeemable, and she means it. Millions and millions of people. Has she ever talked that way about radical Islam? No.
The prospect that the final weeks of this election might be dominated by a terrorist attack, or more than one, has been talked about for a long time now. And today was a test case for how both candidates would deal with this kind of event. So, Mark, my question to you is, how do you think they did?
I think they both played to their strength. I think each of them's got 2 things going for them. For Hillary Clinton, she's got a more traditional resume on national security. Voters, on some measures, look at her as stronger there. And Trump does things that are untraditional that the Clinton folks and Hillary Clinton can jump on. On Trump's side, he has been a strength candidate. He talks about immigration. He talks about fighting terror in a way that base voters, Republican base voters at least, find appealing. And the other thing Trump has going for him is traditionally Republicans have done better when national security is at the forefront. Not always, but traditionally and usually.
Right.
And I think right now, I'm not prepared to say who did better today or who's going to win if this dominates, but they both showed their cards that they think are strong.
Right. I mean, it's always uncomfortable for us when we try to talk about the political implications of these things, because there's serious things and people are being hurt and there's threat and jeopardy. And so to talk about like who's politically capitalizing the best is not like it's a little awkward, right? You know, she is. Because of, as you say, her traditional resume, there's also this thing now that the temperament contrast that she's trying to do, which is essentially to say, I am not only more experienced in a traditional way, but I'm also just more sober, and I'm going to be
into that every day.
Calming. And you know, and Trump is doing things that do play to his strengths, but they're also, I mean, he says things that are ridiculous today. You know, the idea that if Trump became president, terrorism would end. We will never have events like this in the future. I don't think there's any reasonable person who believes that anybody in the Oval Office can end terrorism. But for some number of Republican voters, and it's true what you say, the Republican Party right now, generically speaking, is held in higher regard by voters than Democrats are on this question of keeping the country safe.
And there are many Democrats who say if terror is front and center, it'll help Trump. So yeah. She worked really hard. Her team worked really hard. It's clear neither side's going to give any quarter, change the subject. They both recognize when this dominates the news, this is what they have to talk about. This is the terrain they have to fight on. All right. President Obama just happens to be in New York City today because he's attending the opening of the UN General Assembly. He did take some time out to speak to the country about the attacks, just as the reports that the bombing suspect in the New York and New Jersey cases was being arrested started to emerge. The president wouldn't say much about the ongoing investigation, and he stuck to his now patented and very notable calm and measured approach, which he usually exhibits in the aftermath of terror attacks.
You know, at moments like this, I think it's important to remember what terrorists and violent extremists are trying to do. They are trying to hurt innocent people, but they also want to inspire fear in all of us and disrupt the way we live, to undermine our values. And so even as we have to be vigilant and aggressive, both in preventing senseless acts of violence, but also making sure that we find those who carry out such acts and bring them to justice, we all have a role to play as citizens in making sure that we don't succumb to that fear.
We are going to have White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest on the show in a couple minutes. But first, Mark, how do you think that Barack Obama has handled the past 48 hours?
Well, this is the president's style, and he's never going to change, just as Donald Trump's never going to change. And I think that he did everything appropriately. But it is the case, again, as you said, we're talking about the politics here. No one has been killed, and thank goodness for that. But it's a reality that we're in the midst of 50 days out, the reality of the presidential campaign. I think Donald Trump likes Barack Obama's tone on this because it plays into this notion that he can lump Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama together, that they're insufficiently viscerally outraged by what's happened. The president's outraged, but this is his style. This is how he shows it. And he does care about balancing talking tough with trying to have again, a Obama view of the right way to fight terror, short and long term.
Here's the thing that we have no idea what's going to happen in the next 50 days, and I think we all pray that there's not another single terrorist incident for the next 50 days, for the next 500 days. But the possibility that there will be a ramping up of these kinds of attempts in the United States for the next 50 days, because a lot of foreign provocateurs want to destabilize our election, I think it's perfectly possible. And the potentially dangerous the eventuality of that for Democrats is that if things do ramp up, and it seems to be happening more frequently, this calm and measured tone that Barack Obama has, which I think is the right way to govern, could be really politically problematic for Democrats and could really play into Trump's hands, even though, again, I say it's the right thing for him to do is try to keep people calm rather than exacerbating people's fears.
It could hurt presidential candidates on his party, but also down ballot. The other thing I'll say, though, in the president's support, the coordination here between federal, state, and local seems to have been exceptionally good, and that's to the president's credit.
All right, we're moving on. The trial over Bridgegate started today as two former associates of New Jersey Governor Chris Christie face charges related to closing of lanes on the George Washington Bridge, the traffic scandal, Bridgegate. And they're involved in doing that to try to punish a local official in Fort Lee. Chris Christie has said he knows nothing about the incident, and he said that over and over and over again. But in the opening arguments of the trial, federal prosecutors said that former Port Authority official David Wildstein, who pleaded guilty and is expected to testify in the trial, had bragged, and I put quotes around that word bragged, to Christie about the closures while they were underway. Christie is leading Donald Trump's transition team, as everyone knows, and he could be in line for a big job in the Trump administration. White House Chief of Staff, U.S. Attorney General, possibly a big future for Chris Christie. So my question to you, Mark, is there's some very vivid language today describing what happened in this and asserting that Christie knew basically not that he was involved in planning it, but that he knew all about it in real time, basically. How bad could this be for Christie?
Well, it could be horrendous, but it's baffling to me that there's no talk of his being indicted, since if the prosecution believes he knew in real time, he clearly told them, not under oath, we're told, but nonetheless he told federal investigators that he didn't know about it. They're saying he did. I guess maybe they're saying they're giving the benefit of the doubt that he forgot somehow. but the reality is that Christie still denies it, and there seemed, as far as we know, they're basing it on the testimony just of Wildstein, and I guess
that is a question.
They're going to say he's a questionable witness, but the prosecutors obviously don't think he's a questionable witness because their case is built around him to some extent.
All the following things are true. I think it's correct to say that you can't be charged with perjury unless you've given testimony under oath. You can be charged with a false statements, a violation of a false statements law pretty much any time. If you lie to a government official, you can be charged with that. There is the question of Wildstein and his veracity or his credibility. I just think that the reality is we go back to when this whole scandal first unfolded, and we, knowing a fair amount about how Chris Christie's office ran at the time and still runs even now, it just always seemed implausible that no one mentioned to Chris Christie, bragged about it, boasted about it, let him know what was going on, that there might have had some role in it. I think every reporter was skeptical about that. And to hear these lawyers now asserting it in very vivid terms makes you kind of think, I think there's something there. I think there's something there.
Let the trial play out. Let the trial play out. But man, Seems weird.
Could be very bad for Christie.
The prosecutors say he did a bad thing.
Attorney General? No Attorney General, if true.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, Hillary Clinton is struggling to reunite the Obama coalition. We're going to talk about that and more right after this. In her quest for 270 electoral votes, Hillary Clinton is trying to put the Obama coalition band back together as she attempts to gin up more support from the masses of young voters and minority voters that turned out in record numbers over the past two presidential cycles. But honest Democrats will tell you that Hillary Clinton has got some enthusiasm ground to make up with those groups. Today at Temple University in Philadelphia, Hillary Clinton made a very direct appeal to one of the groups that have been lukewarm about her campaign, the millennials.
I know that with Washington paralyzed by big money and partisanship, the gap between the change we want and the progress that politics should deliver can look like a chasm. I also know that even if you're totally opposed to Donald Trump, you may still have some questions about me. I get that. Register your friends. Register everyone you know. This is going to be close. We need everyone off the sidelines. Not voting is not an option. That just plays into Trump's hands. It really does.
Another directed impassioned appeal over the weekend from President Obama. He was speaking to hesitant African-American voters at a Congressional Black Caucus dinner Saturday night in D.C.
There's no such thing as a vote that doesn't matter. It all matters. And after we have achieved historic turnout in 2008 and 2012, especially in the African-American community, I will consider it a personal insult, an insult to my legacy, if this community lets down its guard and fails to activate itself in this election. You want to give me a good send-off? Go vote!
So that's Hillary Clinton's millennial problem, her African-American problem, and then there's her Hispanic problem. Recent polls show that Clinton is underperforming President Obama's 2012 numbers amongst Latino voters in important states such as Florida, despite Donald Trump having his own problems with Hispanic voters. So, John, why does Hillary Clinton still have a problem with the so-called coalition of the ascendant
Well, you know, the place to start, obviously, why she's having a problem with the Obama coalition is that she's not Barack Obama, and that is true in a lot of different ways. She's not cool the way that Obama was.
A lot of them weren't interested in politics; they were interested in Barack Obama.
They were interested in Barack Obama. She's not for millennials. She doesn't cool. You can even hear it in Hillary Clinton's voice there when she's talking to millennials. She's not talking to them the way millennials in a way that kind of makes millennials think, oh, I'm psyched about voting for that candidate. She's got different problems.
You're cool enough, Hillary.
She's got different problems with Hispanics and different problems with African Americans. But an interesting question will be when this is all said and done. You know, they decide not to do a lot of Hispanic language advertising, which may be a mistake. The interesting question is they spent a lot of time this summer, you know, focusing on trying to target moderate Republicans who are uncomfortable with Donald Trump, rather than focused on their base and on the Obama coalition. We'll know on Election Day, but that is now looking to be maybe a bit of dubious strategic choice.
They do a lot of work behind the scenes with earned media, with all these groups, and they have more people working on it than ever. And they've got super surrogates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Barack Obama and others reaching out for them. She's got to do this. Like with so much of this race, now that it's tightened up, she's got to earn it. She's got to do it. Will she be as cool as Barack Obama? Will she have as direct appeal to African Americans as Barack Obama? No. But she's going to have to figure out a way to talk to them about issues they care about. I'll give you one example: climate change. I don't really hear her emphasizing it very much. She does on occasion.
I agree.
But there are issues millennials care about, for instance, that I think she's got to prove to them she earns their vote.
But it is, I think, really importantly, this is partly a generational problem. Where you see it most strongly is millennials, then millennial African Americans and millennial Hispanics, and this is a generational problem for her. She's you know, full generation older than Barack Obama, and finding a way to talk to all those groups in a way that they find relatable. It's not obvious or easy for her. She can do it, but it's not obvious and easy.
There's been a Democratic president for 8 years, and a lot of them don't feel like things have gotten
right. And they don't know that much about the Clinton legacy. What they do know, they're uncomfortable with. There's a lot of things to say.
All right, up next, White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest stops by our New York studio after these words from our sponsors.
Joined now by the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the congressman from the great 3rd District of New Mexico, Representative Ben Ray Lujan. Congressman, great to see you. Let me ask you one question just to start things off. What odds do you give right now on the possibility of the Democrats retaking control of the House?
Oh, well, it's not my job to make predictions. It's my job to win races. So I'll leave the predictions to others. I'm just going to work one vote at a time, one district at a time, and make sure we maximize our wins.
Congressman, I appreciate that. I wasn't asking you to make a prediction, though. I was asking you to just give us a sense of how likely you think it is, just in general terms, even if you don't want to put specific odds on it. How likely do you think it is? How good a chance do you think you have of retaking control of the House?
Well, we're in a volatile environment that we're working in and just trying to maximize the battlefield that we've established. So I don't know that I can even describe it as a likely or unlikely environment. I know that we're on offense and we're going to be picking up seats, but Donald Trump is definitely giving us the environment that shows that there is a path forward, given especially over the last couple of years that people have discounted it completely. So given the environment that we're in, racing up to the last 50 days to Election Day, plus Donald Trump, it's a very positive environment for Democrats across the country.
Congressman, I know every race and every set of candidates is different, but make the argument that your party in general is stronger based on its record and policy positions on fighting the war against terrorism than the Republican Party is.
Well, right now, as you travel around the country, and especially given everything that happened over the last 48 hours, not only up in Minnesota, but here in New York as well. First off, everything that we can say to go out to the families that were impacted by this horrific event really leads to where people are feeling that they are in America today, that things are unsafe. And I can say the difference between Democrats and Republicans is the contrast that we're seeing even with Donald Trump is that Republicans are more about talk rather than tough and smart policies, the recklessness that we're seeing from Donald Trump. And here's what it comes down to between House Democrats and House Republicans is House Republicans time and again have voted for budgets that reduce funding for more support to the FBI, to the law enforcement agencies, and to the intelligence community that Democrats have been asking for. And Republicans refuse to overturn sequestration, which is further impairing our ability to be able to invest in the safe nature of keeping people in a better place in America. That coupled with, again, more talk from Republicans rather than tough and smart policies is why Democrats are in a stronger place given the environment that we're in today, and especially when it comes to national security, both foreign and domestic.
Congressman, in looking at President Obama's record on fighting terrorism, both homeland security and fighting ISIS and other groups abroad, do you consider his record to be perfect, or are there areas where you would have liked him to have done better?
Well, under President Barack Obama, with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Osama bin Laden is no longer. There was a very clear directive given to the president to make sure that he went after Osama bin Laden. And the president is working diligently with airstrikes, going after ISIS infrastructure, ISIS fighters, and cutting off ISIS money. The president and
with all Congressman, with all due respect, I'm asking you if there's any areas where you think he hasn't done a good job. I know there are lots of areas where you think he has, but are there areas where you think the president has fallen short in fighting terror?
Well, the president has made it very clear that his #1 goal is to go after ISIS. And I think that it's important that we continue to work with the president when it comes to working with Silicon Valley and providing the president the support that he is asking for when it comes to the FBI and his intelligence agencies to work with him. And so with that being said, I'll continue to work with the president with the directives that he's given us to keep the American people safe.
Just ask you one more time, are there any areas where he's fallen short, or has he been, in your view, perfect in fighting the war on terror?
Look, there's always places that we can strengthen what we're doing in America, but when the president is not getting the tools that he needs from a budgetary perspective for more training and the FBI plus-ups that we're looking at as well with counterterrorism activity, we have to work with the teams that we have. And with that being said, the president is working diligently through the intelligence communities and the FBI to make sure that we're keeping people safe in America. But there's more that must be done when it comes to monitoring what's happening online to be able to combat ISIS wherever they may be, and especially as online tools are being used more and more to reach out to bad people around the world, namely in America. And that's more that we can do as well.
Congressman, we were just talking about Hillary Clinton's effort to try to activate the Obama coalition. I want to ask you about Hispanic votes. There's some concern right now among a lot of Democrats that although Hillary Clinton's doing well in terms of the percentage of Hispanic votes that she has the support of, she's not generating a lot of enthusiasm. That's a pretty important voting bloc. So give me a sense of how well you think she's doing with Hispanic voters and what you think she could do better.
Well, I would say all across America, every voting bloc in the United States, we have to be working more and more diligently to earn and maintain the trust of voters. This includes the Latino community. You know, as the first Hispanic chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, it's something that is very important to me personally, and we're making sure that we're communicating to Latinos in a more direct fashion. I think what we're seeing from the Clinton campaign, in addition to what we're doing as House Democrats, is a very active program in communicating early, developing a strong ground game that's comprised predominantly of Latino field staff in those Latino communities. But it's not just in communities where it's a 30% or 40% Latino community. It's also in districts where the Latino community makes up 3 or 4%. We're going after every voter across America, and especially in the Hispanic community.
Congressman, do you think there's a, do you perceive what a lot of Democrats perceive right now, which is that there's a worrying lack of enthusiasm among Hispanic voters for Hillary Clinton?
I think that
or do you think everything's just fine?
Well, we can always do better with every demographic, and in this case, as the numbers are showing, with where the Latino community is, but it's only after Labor Day. And so right after Labor Day is when the general elections kick off and more communications taking place in the community, and I expect that we will do better, and especially in the Latino community as well.
Congressman, in the last few 50 days of this campaign, which 2 issues do you think will determine which way voters vote above all the others? Which are the 2 most important?
Well, I would say this is a security election, whether we're talking about the national security of the American people or economic security. And even though there's a strong foundation that we can build from an economic perspective, there's a lot of real anxieties that are out there to make sure that we're able to help people get ahead and stay ahead. And then also to make sure we're keeping people safe. That's our #1 priority. And keeping people safe is both with national security issues as well as with economic security issues. Those will be the 2 drivers come November and forward.
All right, Congressman Ben Ray Lujan, thank you very much for coming on the show. We'll be happy to have you back at some point soon as we get closer to Election Day. We'll also talk more about how Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are responding to acts of violence. The acts of violence took place this weekend when we come right back.
Welcome back. Joining us now, 2 great political minds. Ed Rogers, a Republican strategist who is not currently supporting Donald Trump. He also writes a column for the Washington Post. and Harold Ford Jr., former congressman from Tennessee and a big supporter of Hillary Clinton. Gentlemen, welcome. Harold, you first. How worried would you say Democrats have been over the last 10 days or so as the national and battleground state polls have tightened?
Probably some have been, but I think that the ones that are closest to the campaign are involved with Secretary Clinton expected a lot of this. You cannot maintain those kinds of leads. Now, having said that, I think it causes or will call for some strategic adjustments as we get along here. We've got a week to go before one of the big pivots in the campaign where the first debate takes place. You can imagine there's a lot of not only strategizing but practicing and rehearsing for that. And I think Secretary Clinton understands this is one of those moments where she's going to have to distinguish herself as not only the big thinker and the mature thinker, but the one most poised and ready to lead the country. If she stays in that lane and doesn't try to get into the mud with him, I think she will emerge as the winner. And I think that's the approach that's being taken now.
Ed, to the extent Trump doing well has caused the gap to narrow, what has he been doing well?
Well, actually, he's been doing less, and maybe that can translate into him doing well or better. Actually, his number sort of sits there between 44 and 40, and Hillary kind of comes up and down. And so he really hasn't picked up so much support as I think her numbers are moving around. That said, I don't think there's one person over at the Clinton camp that didn't think she wouldn't have a double-digit lead against Donald Trump 6 months ago. So they got something that's not working. And maybe Trump is going to segue into something that does work. I mean, this is a change election, and he is the change candidate, maybe too much. This is a change election. She is not a change candidate. If it's close and they go into these debates and she makes a mistake, the race could pivot to him. It can happen.
Harold, I want to ask you a question that Mark and I just discussed earlier in the show. We've now seen pretty compelling evidence that all of the important components of the Obama coalition are not there with as enough enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton as they were for Barack Obama in 2012 and 2008. Millennials, African-American voters, Hispanic voters. Why is that, do you think? What's the core problem she has, and what can she do to fix it?
Well, I think first of all, that's a great question, and I'm a strong believer that reassembling the coalition that the president built in 8 and strengthened in 12 is the one. The president made an effort, I think, Saturday night in Washington at one of the big congressional dinners to make the case. Whatever the reasons are, it could be that, I think sometimes when if you are in a party and you've won a few times and things are moving along the right way, you sometimes can get a little complacent. I think, too, the Clinton campaign has got to reach out in a more effective and a more sustained way. I know they believe that they are, and they have been, but they've got to be even more creative and to reach out to the youth community, the black community, Hispanic community across the country, because those communities are waiting to come around her. And finally, every 4 years things are different. And this campaign, to Ed's point, I hope that everyone is listening, particularly on my side. There may need to be some changes, just small things as you get into the game here. I mean, the Patriots have won a lot of Super Bowls over the last few years, but even they have to make adjustments during a game against every team. Secretary Clinton is the dominant player in this game, and we may just have to make a few adjustments as we go along here to ensure that we win.
Hillary Clinton is uninspiring. That's a big problem. And even on a day like today, she used the occasion, said a lot of the appropriate things about the 2 terrorist attacks here in New York and in Minneapolis. But she wants to talk about the insider meeting she's been in Washington. She wants to show her composure and poise in contrast to Trump, when really what she needs to do is not so much worry about Trump, but she has to sound the alarm. She has to make people understand she has some visceral reaction to either the economy or a terrorist attack. She is uninspiring. She's flat. The dogs don't like the dog food. And if she doesn't do something about it, Trump can sneak up on her, and we can have President Trump, courtesy of Hillary's sort of nonfeasance.
Ed, let me follow up with you just on that, because you just mentioned how Hillary Clinton reacted to the terrorist incidents today. How do you look at it as a Trump skeptic, as someone who's not behind Donald Trump by any means? How do you think Donald Trump performed today from what you saw?
Sloppy, ragged, calling in to a morning news show and sort of craving some sort of acknowledgement that he was first. There was nothing poised about it. But Trump has a visceral reaction. I think people want to know that the next president understands the terrorists are now here. The fight is here. San Bernardino, Orlando, now this, Minnesota. The fight is here. People want there to be a visceral reaction. Trump could have done a lot better. Like I said, what I say, I think it was ragged and way off the bullseye. I think Hillary was flat and stale and looked like business as usual. What's going to win that fight? I don't know.
Guys, we may not get a chance to have you back before Monday's debate, so I want to start talking about that with both of you. Ask the same question about Hillary Clinton first. Harold, you first. If Hillary Clinton said to you, Harold, what's the biggest mistake, the biggest pitfall, the biggest danger for me in this debate, what would you tell her?
Don't fall into the pit with Donald Trump and the back and forth and the slinging of the mud. I think at each moment, she's going to disagree with him on a lot of things. Let him make his point. I think it comes back to her, and she makes the point, Lester, or Mr. Holt, I disagree and differ with my opponent. Here's what I would do and how we would make America strong. I think she's got to stay in the substantive lane. I've said on this show before, you've got to smother him with ideas and answers and vision. And to Ed's point about being inspiring, I think all of that will just continue the inspiration that she's brought to this campaign.
Ed, what's the biggest danger for Clinton and what's the biggest danger for Trump in the debate?
Well, both candidates have got to try to steer clear of play into their negative stereotype. Trump has got to be poised, have a modicum of dignity, and be informed. He's sort of got to be that character that briefly appeared at the press conference with the president of New Mexico a couple of weeks ago. Hillary can't tell a lie. Hillary, if she tells a lie, there'll be ads. The RNC will be running them before the debate's over with. If she plays to her negative stereotype by saying something that is demonstrably false, it could be a real dagger for her.
All right, Ed Rogers, Harold Ford Jr., thank you both, guys. Appreciate it. We're going to look down the road and next with some talk about down ballot races and the presidential campaign. Two top reporters. If you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM in the nation's capital. We'll be right back. With us now, two of the nation's finest political reporters to talk about the battle for the battleground states. Joining us, Eliana Johnson, the Washington editor of the National Review, and Phil Rucker, national reporter for the Washington Post. Phil, you and Dan Balz wrote a story over the weekend. One fact caught my eye. You said the Clinton campaign looks at Ohio and Iowa and sees real trouble. Talk about that.
That's right. So these are two of the swing states where she is the most vulnerable. There's a large white population there that seems to be pretty galvanized and energized around Donald Trump's candidacy. The public numbers show Trump with a growing lead both in Iowa and Ohio, but the Clinton campaign, they're worried about those two states. Now, the good thing for Clinton is that she has an easy path to get to those 270 electoral votes without those two states. They're looking really good in North Carolina, which is a very close race. But a state that the Clinton people feel like could be a real roadblock for Trump and can block off his path there, as well as in Pennsylvania, a big state, a lot of electoral votes in PA.
Eliana, obviously we all play with electoral college calculators all day. If you take Ohio and Iowa and give them to Trump, how much easier does that make it for him, or is that not a huge step towards 270, the prospect of 270?
You know, it's really interesting. It looks like we're on a path where Donald Trump could be the first Republican in I don't even know how many years, but to win Ohio and lose the presidential race, which would be fascinating. But the white whale for Republicans for many, many years now has been Pennsylvania, and I just don't see a path for Trump to get to 270 votes, even if he wins Ohio and Iowa, without taking Pennsylvania. There are some far-fetched scenarios, I think, where he could get there, but I find it tremendously difficult for him to get there without taking Pennsylvania, and he continues to trail Hillary Clinton by between 6 and 8 points there.
So, Eliana, are you saying you think that with that, Pennsylvania is a must-win state for Donald Trump, kind of no matter what the other combinations are? Or is there some way with Ohio, Iowa, and then throw in, say, North Carolina and Florida, there's some path there for Trump to get to 270 without Pennsylvania?
Yeah, there's a path for him with North Carolina, Florida, Maine's 2nd Congressional District, Ohio, Iowa. He does have a path. It's not impossible, but I think it's a difficult path and a rather unlikely one for him.
Phil, I ran into you up in New Hampshire just the other day. Tell me about just thinking about not maybe some of the biggest battleground states. You mentioned Iowa, New Hampshire's another one. To talk about the state of play in places like New Hampshire and some of what we could consider kind of minor battleground states where things seem to be tightening up all of a sudden, say Colorado, New Hampshire, et cetera.
Exactly. It's interesting. So New Hampshire is a sliver of a state. It's tiny. There are only 4 electoral votes. But we were both there for Tim Kaine's event. That was his 3rd visit in 5 weeks. And the reason is because New Hampshire is one of these states that could really tip the scales one way or the other if this electoral map looks really tight. Another state like that is Nevada. 4 electoral votes out there, too. These are close states. They're very competitive. New Hampshire, in particular, has a tendency to make big swings sort of late in the game here. It certainly seems to be an environment that favors Hillary Clinton. It's a place where she has been leading by a lot, but it's tightened up a lot. The Senate race in New Hampshire also has tightened up a lot. Kelly Ayotte very much in the game there for her re-election. So it's a place where Trump was last week as well, and it's a place that could be tight all the way to the end.
Okay, Eliana Johnson, Phil Rucker, thanks to you both. Great to have you as always. We'll be right back with the press secretary of the White House, Josh Earnest, after this.
We have a lot to unpack with our next guest. White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest joins us from our set in New York. Josh, we're sorry we're not there with you, but it's good to have you on the show.
A rare trip for me to New York, and you guys aren't here. I'm going to rearrange all the books on the shelves while you guys are gone.
Yeah, I had a feeling you probably were. That was kind of the no good you'd be up to. Josh, give an update about where the president, about what the president thinks about what's happened in the wake of this weekend. He gave a statement today. Just bring us up to date on where things are.
Well, I think, John, the first thing we have to do is we have to give credit where it's due to our men and women in law enforcement. We saw seamless coordination between state and local law enforcement officers and federal officials. You got, law enforcement guys on the street walking the beat, doing the good police work to track this individual down. But you also have, FBI experts using their forensic skill and technology to trace this person. And, in the space of a little over 24 hours, you go from a device going off somewhere in Manhattan to a name being released by the FBI as a potential suspect, and then that person just a few hours later being brought into custody. So this is really a testament to the heroism of our men and women in law enforcement. The investigation is continuing, and we obviously want to learn as much as we possibly can about this individual, about what may have motivated him, about what ties he had to other people who may have been involved, and obviously that work is just beginning.
Josh, do you agree with the Clinton campaign that Donald Trump, through the words he uses in the course of the campaign, can actually hurt America's security?
Well, I think there's no denying that the rhetoric that we've heard from a lot of Republicans, including the nominee, is contrary to our values and does undermine the argument that we are making against ISIL. The fact of the matter is the president has organized an international coalition to go after ISIL. And we've taken 14,000 airstrikes in Iraq and in Syria combined. We've had some success in taking senior ISIL officials off the battlefield, including 2 external plotters, leading external plotters, just in the last couple of weeks. But we also know that ISIL is trying to propagate a radical ideology, a bankrupt false mythology that they're establishing a caliphate and trying to inspire vulnerable individuals to carrying out acts of violence. That's why we need to make sure that we're not just taking the fight to ISIL on the ground. We're going to destroy this terrorist organization. But we also need to make sure that we're doing this consistent with our values and consistent with a strategy that doesn't allow ISIL to successfully make the case that somehow they represent true Islam in a war against the West.
Josh, you made a comment earlier today about how the battle between the West and ISIL is a battle of narratives. The Trump campaign jumped all over that and basically said you were completely out to lunch and out of touch by even framing the battle in those terms. How do you respond to that charge?
Look, there's no denying that we have starkly different views about the most effective way to take on this fight. But the rhetoric that we hear from Republicans does often undermine the case that we're making against ISIL. First of all, our first and foremost priority is protecting the American people, and that includes using our military power, our intelligence, our law enforcement to keep the American people safe. And the president has demonstrated a willingness and a success in making those orders, designing that strategy, and implementing it. But what we also need to be aware of is the fact that there is a battle that ISIL wants to wage of narratives. They want to drive a narrative that they represent Islam and that they are representing Islam in a war against the West. That is false. It is not true. The fact is there are millions of patriotic Muslims in the United States right now that are serving in our military, that are serving in our law enforcement, that are also our teachers and lawyers and doctors and nurses. These are individuals who are making an important contribution to our great country. And to deny that fact or to obscure that fact to win political points is shameless, it's inconsistent with our values, and it undermines our effectiveness to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL.
Right. And the rare exception to that are those people who've come here, become naturalized citizens, and then committed acts of terror here in the United States. Donald Trump and other Republicans say that the system needs to be changed dramatically to keep that from happening. Is that a fair charge? Are there things that need to change for vetting of people who come in this country to try to keep those instances, rare as they are, from happening?
Well, the thing we first should acknowledge, and this is something that our critics do not acknowledge, is the fact that refugees who come to the United States are subjected to more vetting than any other individual that enters the country. Certainly more vetting than somebody who enters on a tourist visa or on a business visa. Refugees have to go a background check. They have to undergo an in-person interview. Biometric information is collected about them. And then that information is run through a variety of national security databases that are maintained by our military, our intelligence community, by international law enforcement organizations. They are thoroughly vetted. And what I will say is, if there is more that we can do to strengthen that even further, we're certainly open to that. But we shouldn't enter into a situation where we are doing something that some Republicans have suggested, which is essentially imposing a religious test on people who seek to enter the United States, a Muslim ban, basically saying.
But Josh, short of a religious test, though, are you saying that the fact that this happens on occasion is just sort of the cost of doing business, or we shouldn't accept the fact that some people are welcomed into this country and then commit acts of terror, and we should change the system to stop it?
What I'm suggesting is that the most effective way for us to deal with this is not to shut down the refugees process and try to erect walls and keep people out of our country. What we should do is seek to ensure that we've got strict vetting of refugees who are entering the United States. That's exactly what we've done. We also need to implement an effective homeland security strategy, both in terms of effective law enforcement, but also in terms of making clear to people who are at risk of potentially being radicalized by ISIL that they have a home in the United States. The president spoke very movingly about this earlier this year. He went to a mosque just outside of Baltimore and delivered a very personal message, a direct message to young Muslims all across the country, and made clear that they do belong in the United States, that they are welcome as part of this American community. And making sure that we're delivering that message, that's the most effective way for us to prevent ISIL from radicalizing vulnerable populations here in the United States. That obviously is paired with an effective military strategy that is going after ISIL, that is taking back territory and taking out their leaders. But we also can't lose sight of that important element of our strategy as well. And the president's determined to make sure that we don't lose sight of that, not only because it's an important part of our national security strategy, it's also consistent with our values as Americans.
Josh, I want to take you back to a couple of events of a couple days ago and point out what seems to me to be two events that seem to be somewhat in contradiction to each other. The first was President Obama on Friday, when Donald Trump, in that kind of a terse and tepid way that he did, withdrew himself from the posture of asserting that President Obama might not have been born in the United States, the birther day. President Obama came out and basically said, I don't really want to talk about this. It's not important. We got more important things to focus on. Literally the next night, you had him in front of the Congressional Black Caucus, as fired up, I think, as I've ever seen him in a campaign event, saying that if people don't vote for him, or for Hillary Clinton, that is, if people don't vote for Hillary Clinton, that he'll consider it a personal insult. It seems to me that he's pretty riled up about Donald Trump, and yet, as I say, around the birther thing, he seemed to try to slough it off. What's his emotional state right now relative to the cause of stopping Donald Trump from being president?
Well, I think the president is quite energized about this campaign, and he understands the stakes in this campaign. And look, the stakes in this campaign are not about about repudiating Donald Trump. The stakes in this campaign are about making sure that we build on the progress that we've made in this country over the last 8 years. Let's make sure that we build on the Affordable Care Act and expand access to health care to even more Americans. Let's make sure we build on the economic progress that we've made by continuing to raise wages for low and middle income families and making sure that we're also continuing to reduce the deficit. Let's make sure that we are building on our progress in fighting the causes of climate change. Let's make sure that we are more effectively implementing a Wall Street reform strategy in the same way that strengthens our economy. That's what's at stake in this election. That's why the president's fired up and ready to go.
I get all that, Josh, but I have to say, when the president starts using the phrase personal insult, if people don't vote for Hillary Clinton, it seems like it's more like there's something going on there that's more than just a squandered opportunity if Hillary Clinton lost. He seems to be very personally invested in this in a different way.
There is no denying that he is very personally invested in what we've done over the last 8 years. He's poured his heart and soul into the progress that our country has made, and he's so proud of the progress that we've made. Right. He was speaking to a room full of supporters, and he basically was saying, my name's not on the ballot, but all of the work that we've done over the last 8 years is. So you need to get engaged and get just as fired up for Hillary Clinton as you were for me.
Okay. All right, Josh Earnest, thank you so much for being on the show. We're sorry we weren't there with you. We'll see you next time, and we will be right back. to BloombergPolitics.com right now for coverage of the UN General Assembly, as well as the Clinton Global Initiative's annual meeting. Coming up on Bloomberg West, GoPro CEO Nick Woodman. Until tomorrow, from me and Mark here in Minneapolis, we say sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's begin with a check of your first word news. The man wanted for questioning in connection with the weekend bombings in New York and New Jersey is in custody. 28-year-old Ahmad Rahami was arrested after being shot and wounded during a shootout with police in Linden, New Jersey. Authorities say 2 officers were wounded but were not believed to have been seriously hurt. The Council on American Islamic Relations, a national Muslim advocacy group, welcomed Rahami's arrest. More than 2 dozen people were wounded in the blast on Saturday night in New York City's Chelsea neighborhood. A pipe bomb also exploded Saturday in Seaside Park, New Jersey, prior to a scheduled race for Marines and sailors. No one was hurt in the blast. Meantime, a device exploded at the train station in Elizabeth, New Jersey Sunday night as a bomb squad robot tried to disarm it. No injuries were reported. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio told reporters, quote, "We have every reason to believe this was an act of terror."
There is no other individual we're looking for at this point in time, and that's very important to answer your question. Second, vigilance is called for.
Investigators say they have, quote, "no indication that the suspect was part of a broader cell." Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. Bloomberg West is next.
This is Bloomberg West. Coming up, it's liftoff for GoPro. Shares soar as the company unveils its Karma drone. CEO Nick Woodman explains why this is the product to get his company back on track. Plus, can Oracle take on Amazon as the company transitions to the cloud? Co-CEO Mark Hurd tells us why he thinks Amazon is within reach. And highly anticipated new guidelines for autonomous vehicles coming from U.S. highway regulators this week, how they could spur changes in the car industry. But first, to our lead. GoPro stock takes off. The action camera maker just unveiled a handful of new products, including its long-awaited consumer drone, Karma. The device will go for $800, fit into a backpack, and come with a game-style controller that shows a live feed of the drone's eye view. GoPro also introduced the latest models of its flagship Hero camera line, including a waterproof version. So why is this a big deal for the company? Well, the drone's release had been postponed once already, and the Hero 4 had been criticized for being late to market and overpriced. GoPro shares are down a staggering 80% from its October 2014 high. Needless to say, analysts had been viewing today's product event as a pivotal moment. I had a chance to sit down with GoPro CEO Nick Woodman after the event and asked how the drone will help the business move beyond capturing amateur footage.
One of the things that GoPro is known for is its versatility. I think that the same phenomena that has so benefited the sales of our cameras will also benefit Karma, and that is our customers buying and using our products for to accomplish things that we haven't even dreamt up, and we expect the same for Karma.
So talk to me about some of the use cases that you foresee.
Well, obviously, consumers are going to have a blast using Karma to capture their lives in a whole new way, whether it's aerial footage or handheld footage or footage mounted to their body while they're skiing or biking. People are going to be able to capture their lives with such professional quality stability that they're only used to seeing in film and television. So that's going to be a major breakthrough, and we think we're entering a new era of high-quality consumer-generated content. It's going to be very exciting. GoPros have already won Emmys for their contributions to the television industry, so we expect Karma to dramatically improve the quality of footage that film and television producers are able to capture with GoPros. And then, as I said before, I think that Karma is so capable and so versatile, whether you're capturing aerial footage, handheld footage, or you're mounting Karma to a vehicle or a bike or a piece of equipment. I mean, I think we're going to see people using Karma to, study shock absorbers in the automotive industry so that they can watch what a shock absorber is doing while the car's driving down the road and improve the performance of those products. So I think it's across the board. Karma is going to be used for a ton of interesting applications.
What are your expectations for sales here? Hundreds of thousands of units, millions?
Time will tell, but I do think that Karma hits a sweet spot. Karma hits a sweet spot with existing GoPro customers. We have millions and millions, over 20 million GoPros sold since the introduction of our first HD Hero back in 2009, and that Karma is compatible with Hero 4 cameras as well as the new Hero 5 Black and Hero 5 Session camera. We think we've got a terrific installed user base that's going to get a lot of